Welcome to the second lecture of the second week. Right now, we're going to talk about Paul as the apostle to the Gentiles. Before we get into his letters, Paul is a fascinating character, and outside of Jesus Christ himself, Paul is the most important figure in early Christianity for us today. It's real interesting to look at Paul in his own time because he is an incredibly controversial figure, and you can tell that by his own writings. Almost every letter that he writes, he's talking about some kind of opposition that he's receiving. So that opposition comes at almost every church that he ever starts. So we know that he's a pretty controversial figure, but he has a huge impact on the early Jesus movement. In the New Testament, we have 13 letters that are attributed to him. The letter to the Hebrews is initially included into the New Testament based on the fact that early leaders of the Jesus movement, or Christianity at the time, those early leaders attributed the Hebrews to Paul, which is why it was included into the New Testament, in spite of the fact that it doesn't say that it was written by Paul at all. And then the letter of Acts is, if Luke is the gospel of Jesus Christ, Acts mostly talks about Paul. He's one of the largest characters in the entire book. So between Paul's 13 letters, Hebrews, and Acts, a large portion of the New Testament deals specifically with the Apostle Paul. So who was this guy, right? Paul was he was the one who originally took the message about Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. Crossing this ethnic line dramatically changed the early Jesus movement forever. Once Paul did this, and it's every indication that Paul was the one to do this, that dramatically changed the early Jesus movement. And within a century, this early Jesus Jewish movement is predominantly Gentile. And that is directly related to the Apostle Paul and what he did. It was very radical. And some New Testament scholars call Paul a radical Jew or even an apostate Jew because of his views related to the law. So who was he? Let's look at his writings first. If you go to your textbook, Ehrman has a really good diagram on page 336 that has Paul's 13 letters all listed there. There are 7 letters that are considered undisputed epistles, which means that all New Testament scholars recognize that Paul wrote those letters. He was, in fact, the author of those letters. And then that leaves 6 other letters. 3 letters are called the pastoral epistles. That's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. It's a broad consensus among New Testament scholars that these letters are not written by Paul. They're called pseudepigrapha, which means written in a false name. That strikes us as scary, maybe in modern times, but this is common practice in antiquity. There are a lot of letters written in the name of Paul that are not in the New Testament, because they simply were not written by him, and they came centuries later. So there's a lot of evidence that people wrote in Paul's name. It was a very honorific thing to do. This happens in Greco-Roman literature as well as in Hebrew writings. So it's very common during this time period to write in somebody else's name, especially if you're a student. So we think that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus were certainly that way. And then there's these 3 epistles we call them the Deutero-Pauline letters, and that's Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. And they're Deutero-Pauline mainly because people don't think that it's possible that Paul wrote them, but it's also as possible that he didn't. Some of the structure in these early churches in those letters indicate that they're later than Paul. So out of the 13, you get 7 undisputed Pauline epistles. 3 Deutero-Pauline epistles, and 3 the pastoral epistles. And that's kind of how New Testament scholarship looks at the letters of Paul. And that might come as a shock to you if you've never heard that before, but it is almost taken for granted. It is taken for granted in the academic circles. And it does have everything to do with how you interpret the Pauline epistles, what they were written, what they were going for, all that. So, and it also kind of goes into some of the reasons why different books were accepted later than others. But all these letters, the 13, began to be compiled and circulated early on. So all of these letters, even the pastoral epistles, were probably written as late as the end of the 1st century or the beginning of the 2nd century. So that's still fairly early. In any case, those are the writings that he wrote. The other large portion of the New Testament that deals with Paul is the Acts of the Apostles. Now, Acts narrates a lot of Paul's life, but Luke is the author of Acts. Luke is not trying to write a detailed history of how things happen. Luke is writing for a particular theological purpose, and he uses the life of Paul to tell that narrative of the growth of Christianity and explain how Christianity moved from a Jewish origin into a Gentile atmosphere. And Paul is the reason Acts gives. But there are some serious disagreements between the letter of Acts revolving around the narrative of Paul's life and what Paul actually says. One in particular comes out of Acts 9. This is where Paul has his revelation of Jesus Christ. After that, Acts says that he goes directly to Jerusalem. According to Galatians, Paul adamantly refuses that and says that he spent 3 years in the desert. So even when it comes down to real important parts of Paul's life like that, Acts doesn't agree with what Paul says himself. The other part is this. It's almost a stock phrase in Acts where it says that Paul would go to a synagogue and preach the gospel. He would get kicked out, and then he would go to the Gentiles. And that is a pattern all through Acts. Paul never says that he does that. Throughout Paul's letters, Paul understands himself as an apostle sent to Gentiles. So those are two very big discrepancies between Acts and Paul. So although Acts says a lot about Paul and uses Paul as a tool in that narrative, we can't look at Acts and say, here you go, this is an autobiography of Paul. That's just not what Acts is doing, which is fine, and is the reason why it differs with Paul. I think Acts is trying to mediate between Paul and between more Jewish Christianity. And so Acts is trying to make Paul not so abrasive and show that he's actually in a direct line with the early Jesus leaders, the Jesus movement leaders in Jerusalem. And so he's trying to mediate that and make Paul a little bit more palatable for those who would oppose him. So what can we know about Paul? The problem about looking to the letters for Paul's life is the fact that those letters that he wrote were very occasional. He wrote those letters to address certain issues that churches were having. So he doesn't give a lot of autobiographical information. Now we can kind of read from those letters and understand what Paul believed, but he doesn't say a lot about his life. Galatians chapter 1, verse 11, through chapter 2, verse 14, there he gives a lot of autobiographical information. In Philippians chapter 3, verses 4 through 10, we get another section of autobiography. And then in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 8 through 11, he says a little bit about where he comes into this Jesus movement. So out of those things, what can we really know? He says that himself, that he is Jewish. He is zealous for the law. He's very, he loved the law, the Torah. He considered himself a Pharisee or endorsed by the Pharisees. He says that he was educated in Jerusalem by a famous rabbi named Gamaliel. And then in Acts tells us that he was born in Tarsus, which is in the diaspora outside of Judea. And there's a great school in Tarsus. So if Tarsus is correct in Acts, then we know that Paul was a Gentile. The fact that he writes letters puts him in the top 10 to 15% of the Greco-Roman world, because it was a largely illiterate world. And the fact that he can write and read lets you know that he has received a very good education, a formal education, to the level of a rhetorical education. That doesn't mean he's been classically trained, but he is highly educated, and the letters that he writes tends to be pretty good Greek. It's called Koine Greek. It's still common Greek. It's not classical Greek, but it's still fluent Greek. The way he writes lets you know that Greek is probably his first language, which is another indicator that he was born outside of Judea. It doesn't look like he has any idea about Aramaic. If he does know Hebrew, it's only to read Torah. But even the way he quotes Scripture, the Scriptures that he quotes, comes from the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So he's Greek in that sense, which probably has a lot to do with how he understands his ministry. What's important about Paul is that he says that he was a persecutor of this early Jesus movement. And then he has this great revelation on the way to persecute others, other early Jesus followers. He has a vision of the resurrected Christ. Christ appears to him, and in that appearance, Paul is dramatically changed. Now, there's controversy whether it's a revelation of Christ that changes him, or whether this is a conversion from one religion to another. That's a big debate in New Testament scholarship. But whether you call it a conversion or just a revelation, it dramatically changed Paul. It changed his view of Jesus. He no longer persecuted people who followed Jesus. He followed Jesus. And the two things about Jesus that were important to him was Jesus' resurrection and Jesus' crucifixion. Those two things are constitute everything Paul preaches. That is Paul's gospel, the good news. If you read through the letters of Paul trying to find out something about Jesus, you won't hear anything about Jesus as a miracle worker. You won't hear hardly anything about Jesus' teachings. The two things that Paul talks about regarding Jesus is Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. And those two things indicate that Paul's very early in the Jesus movement, because later on there's a lot built around those two critical events. Paul doesn't talk about Jesus' birth hardly at all. It is the death and resurrection that is key to Paul's gospel. So Paul changes his understanding of Jesus. And this changes the way he thinks about the law. Because he believes that Christ is this messianic figure, and Jesus is a messianic figure for those beyond Judaism, it changes the way Paul understands the law that he was so zealous for before, and it changes the way he understands Gentiles and incorporates Gentiles into this early Jesus movement. And for that, the way this transformed his understanding of law and Gentiles and the inclusion of Gentiles absolutely makes Paul a radical Jew, if not apostate Jew. And he's the one that then takes the good news to Gentiles, the good news of Jesus Christ. And that good news is constituted of Jesus' death and Jesus' resurrection. So that's Paul. Next lecture, we'll get into Galatians and actually read through the letter that he wrote and determine how this functioned for these churches in Galatia. Take care.